Here we go. So today I am going to talk about limitations of algorithmic fairness between justice and knowledge and between ethics and epistemology. But if you're not familiar with that literature, let me reassure you right away that this is going to be very light in statistical ethics, maybe not light in philosophical ethics, I'm afraid, but there's not going to be much technicality involved. I'm going to keep it at very bare minimum. So basically, what I mean here is by term of group fairness metrics, I'm going to focus on group fairness metrics today, is something that has emerged in the AI ethics literature, most technical literature around it in the last couple of years, which are statistical criteria on the distribution of predictive performances of a statistical model across groups. So what I mean by that, I'm just going to take two examples of fairness metrics. That's all I'm going to need for today. Again, we're going to be very light on math. There's this basic idea that your model should be just as accurate in its prediction across any groups that it affects. So if you have a 75% of correct predictions for a group, then you should have a 75 rate of correct predictions across all groups. And actually, one of the starting points of the literature was the realization that this was not enough, in a sense, that there were other fairness issues, and to maintain equal global performance in terms of accuracy across groups, but other issues such as there's the basic distinction. I'm glossing over some differences here and details to make this talk accessible to everybody. But also the difference between favorable and unfavorable errors. So if you have a 25% error rate across all groups, but one group gets 25% favorable errors, they're getting something they shouldn't get due to a mistake in the model, and the other group gets 25% unfavorable errors, they are systemically denied something that they should get. There's something unfair going on between those two groups. That's why instead of just equalizing accuracy or getting accuracy parity, you should also get sometimes try to get equalizations of odds or odds parity, whatever you want to call it. There are many other metrics, such as calibration, predictive parity value, statistical parity, which is an older metric, but we're not going to get into any of that. We're going to stay very light on math again. And there are also many open debates on the literature, just a couple. There's a couple there. Is there one true metric, or is there a plurality of metric to be used according to context? Are those metrics actually a definition or a measure of fairness? That's another open issue for me. Trade-off with other objectives, of course, and the list goes on and on. But today I'm going to be focusing on the outer limits, so to say, of algorithmic fairness. And I'm going to show you that all of those limits, which are actually connected with each other, even though they don't look like they are in the first place, stem from limitations of knowledge. So basically, there are limitations in the scope of algorithmic fairness that are due to limitations in knowledge. And again, this is about limitation in the outer edge of algorithmic fairness. It's not about saying one fairness metric is wrong, one is right. It's not about saying the entire field is misguided or anything like that. But there are limitations to the way you can apply this. There are also limitations of knowledge. And I'm going to start by something very basic, by reminding everybody that in a very concrete and important way, predictions are not decision. And what you are interested in ultimately from a fairness point of view are the distribution of decisions, not the distribution of predictions. And that's a real problem, actually, because sometimes going from the prediction to the decision is going to mess up with the fairness criteria that you wanted to apply. And so I'm going to, then once I have this problem, I'm going to try to solve it with two potential suggestions. One is the use of a fair lottery as a form of complementation to predictive knowledge. So one of the problems that we're going to have is what happens when my model cannot distinguish really between two individuals. It cannot tell who is going to be the better, the better tenant or the better student or the better creditor or anything like that. Between two people, you have a tie, so to say. Well, how do you complement those limits in your predictive knowledge. And one possible solution is the use of a fair lottery, of course. And I'm going to show you why it's not that simple from a purely ethical perspective. And then one very easy solution, very easy cop-out that you might think of is, well, why don't we get more data, more knowledge, and then we just solve that issue? And I'm going to show you there are huge political challenge, practical and political challenges behind that too. Okay, in the sense of problem, I'm just going to show you that the problem that I'm going to describe now, which is that predictions are not decision, is a hard problem. That's basically what I'm going to do. So let's try to have that problem first. Why is it not trivial to say that predictions are not decisions? So what I'm going to say very briefly is the following. So decisions do not always, and sometimes cannot, flow directly from predictions. So what you're going to have in those situations, and again, those are real world situations, is a composite decision process that mixes a predictive part, so basically your machine learning model, and non-predictive part, where you're going to add other criteria to get to the decision that you want. And there's also non-predictive criteria. They have a non-trivial effect in the sense they can substantially modify the distribution of outcomes, and hence your notion of decision fairness. So this add-on of non-predictive criteria is not innocent, not at all. That's why it's not enough to say that your algorithms satisfy some criteria of fairness, because it doesn't warrant that your final decision is going to satisfy the same criterion. And also, I'm going to say that basically this is all going to be grounded in the basic fact that predictive models are not always enough to make all the necessary distinctions between applicants that you need to make in order to have your final decision in a fair and informed way, of course. So this is going to be the only slightly technical slides. Okay, so bear with me here if you're not familiar with the literature. If you are, this is going to be, of course, much easier, but this is not an argument that I've seen, well, anywhere other than in my own work. So I guess at least it's not common. I cannot say nobody thought about this, but at least it's not common. So imagine maybe you're having I'm going to do a banking example as a running example for reasons that, even though I'm going to refer to academic examples from time to time, and the reasons for this are going to become obvious a little bit later on. So imagine you have a credit score, basically, an algorithm, so a model that gives a score to your applicants to see whether they are going to reimburse a loan that a bank is going to give them. Okay, and the idea is usually, well, everybody gets a score, a sort of probability of refunding your loan, and if you go beyond the decision boundary, then, well, you should get your loan. And maybe there are different populations affected by this. We're just going to call them population A and population B. And in those populations, of course, you're going to have like true positives. So those are the little green waves here, right? So those are the people who get their loan or are going to reimburse them. And there's going to be some favorable errors, right? So those people represented by the cross are people who are actually not able to reimburse their loans, but they're going to get it anyway because of limitations in our model. And as you say, this satisfies certain, I will just look at favorable errors just to keep things light, okay? Not going to look at unfavorable errors. Just we can ignore everything that goes on here for now. It doesn't matter. And you can see here that the number and proportion, more importantly, of favorable mistakes that I've made are pretty similar in both populations. Okay, so this means that my model satisfies equality of odds. The rate of favorable mistakes is the same for both population A and population B, so they cannot complain on that. Okay, but now you're getting a call from your boss who is telling you that there's been a restriction in budget. And you're going to need to get rid of some applicants, sadly enough, even if they were beyond the decision boundary at first, because there's just not enough money. Now, that's your first problem for you. But there's a second one. There's a limit in the precision of your data. Okay, not every distinction, numeric distinction in scores that you have are necessarily very meaningful. So to take a very simple example, if you're a teacher, in France, we grade on 20 points. We have very complicated grading systems in France. And sometimes we compute average to the 100th and sometimes even to the thousandth of a point. But that's funny. That's just funny because many professors in many disciplines will grant you that a hundredth, not even a thousandth of a point, even a tenth of a point for some professor doesn't have any meaning. Okay, so if two of your, let's say, prospective students are just diverging here by a hundredth of a point, it's a numeric difference, but it's completely meaningless. They are empirically equivalent, if you like. It's just that your model doesn't have access to fine enough data to have a really meaningful difference between those two. Okay, but there's some digits behind the dot that are just meaningless. Okay, so you have a zone right above the decision boundary, which is kind of an empirical equivalence. You cannot make any distinction between those guys, basically, based on your model. So what can you do? There's no further use of your model and your data that you can make to distinguish between those people, and you need to get rid of some of them. So the easiest things that you can do is say, well, I'm going to use some causative discrimination here. I'm going to say that the people in the population A have had lesser access to banking historically. So I'm going to be a bit harder on the people in population B. And I'm going to get rid of some people here in the area of empirical equivalence, okay? And it just turns out that, and it's actually a realistic hypothesis, that there are a lot of favorable error right above the decision boundary, because this is often the place where your model is a bit uncertain, plus it may be a bit crowded in terms of applicants. That also happens. And so what happens is I get rid of all the favorable errors in favor of population B. So what happens to my final decision, which is here? Well, it doesn't satisfy equality of odds. And there you have it. A prediction is no longer, doesn't directly flow into a decision. Limitations of your knowledge force you to add non-predictive criteria, such as positive discrimination, that have nothing to do with the knowledge of how you're going to reimburse your loan. And this messes up the distributions of outcomes that you wanted to warrant with your fair model. So that's my first point here. So can we have an easy cop-out for that? Now I'm going to move to the various strategies to cop out with that problem. And the first solution would be to use a fair lottery to distinguish all the candidates that your predictive knowledge cannot distinguish, basically. So let's see if we can get rid of that issue completely and be completely happy with a fair lottery. So what would be the argument of the persons who are in favor of the use of fair lottery in those circumstances? And they might argue, you know, the problem here is that is all due to the fact that you'd use some kind of positive discrimination criteria. That's where the destruction of your distribution of outcome come from. And on top of that, it's not even a solution that is, you know, guaranteed to work in all cases. And here it worked. You managed to get, you know, to select your applicant stringently enough, but you can also add a non-predictive criteria and still end up with ties, you know, with people who both have low income and both come from a minority, or both are women, and so on and so forth, and they're still equal, and you don't know how to split between them. So it doesn't always work, and that's the reason why. And on top of that, it messes up the distribution of outcome. Why shouldn't we use, in all of those cases, just a universal fair lottery? That would be, for the proponents in this, the best non-predictive decision-making you could make, because it doesn't rely on human judgment. So there is no arbitrariness understood as dependence on human whim, if you like. And there's also a perfect veil of ignorance. So what you're going to do is not correlate it at all with the different things that humans are prejudiced about. So if we take my example, we have enough applicants, that's a slight problem here, but if we have enough applicants at least, I'm pretty sure that population A and population B are going to be randomly impacted in the same proportion. And so I'm going to keep the same distribution of outcome after I'm done with my non-composite part, non-predictive part of my composite decision procedures. So this solves all of my issues. I can do that as many times as I want. I can always distinguish between two individuals with a coin toss. It's perfectly fair and unbiased. It allows you to keep a perfectly algorithmic procedure all the way through, in a sense. And so that means that your result on if you satisfy fairness metrics before, you're still going to satisfy it after. You avoid any ad hoc human intervention, and everything is fine. Or is it? That's my problem. I don't have any, downward hostility towards that solution, but I'm not sure it's obvious. Is one. The main reason for this is I'm French. For those of you who don't know, and we had a massive controversy in France around exactly the use of a fair lottery to distinguish between two students applicants to university curricula when they were locked in a time. And back then it was not about a predictive algorithm. Actually, some of the criteria that were used were more positive discrimination criteria, geographic locations, level of income, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't about predictive knowledge, but the rest of the scenario was exactly the same. You were trying to break ties at the edge of the decision boundary with a fair lottery. And it was a huge scandal, absolutely tremendous scandal in the entire country. And it actually was the main motivation for the evolution in the subsequent years of our university admission algorithm, which created other scandals and so on and so forth. And it's a titanic mess. And if you want to spend 2 years reading about this, you can, because there's a gigantic literature on it if you love to read French and learn about French controversies for some reason that is beyond me. But I couldn't escape it. So everything comes from that. When you're French, you can't not possibly, and you work in the university, you couldn't possibly escape that controversy. So back then, there were the answer to that controversy by randomness defenders, so to say. So the people who were defending the solution that I've been exposing, was that this reaction, this gut reaction of indignation by a lot of the public back then was basically, and sometimes president of universities, you have to say, was basically irrational and or ignorant. Because it's based on some misunderstanding that a lottery is fair, it's not biased against anybody, and against the fact that, we have basically exhausted our knowledge on the students when we use this. So there's nothing more we can do, okay? So you cannot tell me it's not meritocratic, and our school system is supposed to be meritocratic, because meritocracy isn't allowing me to make all the distinction between individuals that I need to make. So I'm just doing it when meritocracy has exhausted its abilities, and I complement it with a fair lottery. So actually, the fair lottery, or for that matter, positive discrimination, is not against meritocracy necessarily. It may just come as a complement when the merits of predictive knowledge, desert, what have you, other criteria that you already agreed on, have actually exhausted their powers. So I've heard that many times live, actually, back then, from scientists saying this is irrational. This whole controversy is irrational. And my answer after several months, not right there and then, but after several months of reflection was, is it though? Is it? Or is it that they go from a different version of fairness than the one you're thinking of? Basically, you're thinking of fairness as ignorant, and they think of fairness as knowledge. So what I mean is that there are implicitly, and this is of course a rational reconstruction happening entirely within my brain. It's not based on any sociological studies of opinions of people on this. But I think it fits nicely with the arguments that were thrown around back then. The idea is basically that no distinction shall be made between two individuals that is not grounded in a reason related to those individuals. So basically, you are not allowed to do a distinction between ignorance and ignorance of those individuals. And really, some of the gut reactions of students back then was that the institution shows that they don't care about us because they don't even bother to look at us before they throw one out and take one in. And it was really so as arbitrary, actually. But if you come from a different notion of arbitrariness, which is not dependent on human whim, because clearly a fair lottery is not dependent on human whim. But if you look at some classic French dictionary, you can say that arbitrariness in sharing a good is distribution without norm. It's distribution without a reason. And that's exactly what a fair lottery does. It distributes a good without a reason. And for some people, that's arbitrariness. It's just that there's this two concepts of arbitrariness that we have, which is, so basically the idea of dependence on someone's whims and the idea of something done without a reason. And when you look at a fair lottery, those two regions that usually go together are separated. And they give birth to two alternative notions of fairness. And it's not obvious to say who is right. Because you cannot just say, well, but I just told you that my models doesn't allow me to distinguish between those people. Well, the possible answer from the person who defends fairness as knowledge is that it's not actually, it gives you an obligation to learn more. To further, you cannot consider that your predictive knowledge or whatever, or your list of criteria, whatever they are, is fixed. If you can't make the distinction you need to make, then add more criteria or learn more. But just don't stop there and say, oh, from now on, I'm too lazy, I'm going to throw a coin toss. So you must basically further the procedure until the hierarchy is justified. And actually, that's a way to justify human interventions, because humans are better at reparameterizing their problems, that is, adding a new variable to the problem, while algorithms usually just use the information you give them. They don't take much initiative, do they? And I know that this might strike in the controversy about Parcoursup and APB. There's also a lot of, especially actually in a very good report by the Cour des Comptes, the administrative bodies in charge of public spending in France, saying that, calls for human interventions are sometimes sterile because when you have 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 applicants, the possibility to actually do this is very limited. And that's a very good argument. I'm very sensitive to that. But we must know whether in principle or practical arguments are the ultimate judge here and why we're doing what we're doing. I don't think that at this stage is completely clear. And so it's not a complete solution to my original problem that predictions are not decisions until this is all, cleared out. So, but before we do this, let me try to see another possible solution or maybe cop out for this problem, which is the cost of noise, as opposed to the cost of bias, which is something that sometimes is not insisted upon enough in the literature, I guess, which is that noise is very different from bias and raises different issues. And practically, it's actually a tougher challenge for algorithmic fairness, noise, than bias. So what I mean by that, so I try to give you the arguments that somebody could phrase here as honestly as I can. So there may be another point, so we try to solve the limits of our predictive model, statistical model, by adding something more after that, be it non-predictive criteria or a fair lottery. How about we just correct the problem at the source by looking at the data? How about we get more data? Isn't the industrial promise of AI that there's an unstoppable drive towards more accurate, more personalized data? So why don't we just get more data and be able to make as fine-grained distinctions between individuals as we wish to make? And there's many, many, many problems with that. If your solution consists of putting thousands of sensors in schools so that we can make all the fine-grained distinctions we want to make about students, then maybe some people are going to object about that. But I'm not going to make a general argument about privacy. I'm going to keep running with my banking example in that last part and show you how actually difficult it is to get the proper data, because it is truly difficult. And it's not only difficult intellectually, it's difficult politically and practically. And those are huge challenges. The problem is such solutions. So in the examples that I'm going to make, just to make the idea is a bit richer, is that there are very structural social causes of data noise. Again, not bias, noise. So in a very nice, interesting paper, How Costly is Noise by Blattner and Nelson in 2021, you can see the largest studies ever made on mortgage data for American individuals, more than 50 million applicants. Basically, they had access to all the data for the credit scores of 50 million Americans by one credit bureau against a huge sum of money. And they realized that there's a structural problem for financial data on individuals of lesser means, which is structurally noisier because it's sparser. Basically, it comes with the territory of being poor, that there's less financial data. You make like less transactions, you don't manage a portfolio of stocks, you don't invest in life insurances, you don't invest in real estate, and so on and so forth, because you don't have the money. And so there's less data on you. And because of that, there is structurally more noise in your data, and the models that are run on you to approve your credit application is structurally less knowledgeable about you. And they've done some counterfactual simulations that push the result that 50% of acceptance rate disparity between rich and poor is due to disparity in data precision. Just data precision. There's just not enough data about low-income and minority applicants in the US to basically allow the model to behave in a rigorous, homogeneous, and fair way across groups. So here, lack of precision drives inequality, not bias. And that's very important, because if your balance always overestimates your weight by 4 kilograms, that's bias. And it's very easy to correct once you know it. You just withdraw 4 kilograms to your weight, and now you're good, you have the true value. If your balance gives you a different weight every time you get on it, as some cheap balances actually do, if you move your feet a little bit around the balance, you're going to have 3 different values. Now you don't know what the true value is, even if it might be in there. That's noise. And then there is, well, I know some people would rather distinguish noise and sparsity and precision. That's a topic for another day. I'm just going to say it lacks precision. But you see the point. There's just not enough signal in there for you to run your algorithm. And there's just no easy algorithmic correction for that. Especially if your data becomes so sparse that basically you cannot apply the law of large numbers anymore. And all the basic hypotheses of probabilistic reasoning break down before you can actually run them. And I want to thank Professor Bob Williamson for reminding me of that, because that was really helpful. So let's conclude on this and on the entire presentation. So you have basically no easy way out here. You have massive compounding socio-historic heritage and institutional data collection. And you may say, well, isn't there just enough data out there for this? For instance, some banking institution has promised to add more banking data to credit score bureaus' information to improve things. But the authors of the paper were actually pretty skeptic that it would be enough. There's another solution that has been proposed that you can see in that article by William Douglas Eben, the MIT Tech Rep, and June 17, 2021, when in their reaction to this paper. So simple solution that I'm going to call lend to learn. So that's basically the idea that you start lending to poor people massively so that you can learn more about them, so that you're really able to distinguish who are the good creditors among them, just as for rich people. And then you improve your models, and then you improve your decision making. Which means basically that you need to change institutional behavior first before you actually produce new knowledge, as opposed to give me more data and then I will change my institutional decision, which is what the typical order that you would expect. Here you need to go through a major economic and political hurdle, which is to basically convince major financial actor to go out there and lend to poor individuals, which is usually not their favorite sport. And there are institutional resistance to that. No major lenders in the US has agreed to do that so far. Some small did, but not enough to change the game. So there's a very interesting question about it, where exactly the resistance comes from, but that's a topic for another day. And also need a shift in research from purely algorithmic text-centered approach to more interaction with SSH to understand your data. As one researcher named Richardson said, incomplete data is troubling because detecting it will require researchers to have a fairly nuanced understanding of societal inequities. And that's not easy. So just to conclude on this, and yes, I'm going to be on time. Limits of knowledge limits the scope of algorithmic fairness. Complementation by non-predictive criteria may mess up fairness criteria. Complementing this by fair lottery raises a fundamental question on the relation between fairness and knowledge. And the practical solution of adding more data is actually made with huge practical and political challenges. I could have added, more problems, like if you start massively lending to poor actors, you also create a massive opportunity for predatory lending, by the way. So it becomes a question whether the thing that you're distributing is actually still good. But that's a topic for another day. And I thank you very much for your attention.